Okay, we're back. This is Luke chapter 23. I'm doing 2 chapters this week because they coincide with Holy Week. We're telling the whole Passion story in Luke chapter 22 and 23. And that way that next week we'll be able to talk through the Easter, the resurrection story in Luke chapter 24. So if you're just jumping on 23, you might want to go back in 22 and pick that up and think about it. Otherwise, grab your Bible and plunge right in. So here's the thing about doing one chapter, then stopping the video and doing a new chapter, is that Luke didn't write his book that way. There were no chapter breaks in the text. He just continued writing. He didn't even put the numbers for the verses. He just wrote, kind of like how we would write a letter. So that's just a little reminder. So the story goes on. The Sanhedrin has tried Jesus, and they say, we finally got him. We are able to accuse him both for breaking Jewish law, and we'll get the Romans on our side too. And then we will do that. Jesus is out of line as a blasphemer. Now they just need to get the Romans on board. It's not enough for them to discredit Jesus. The people wouldn't have it. So these leaders, they couldn't just say, hey, this guy is teaching stuff that's not true. The people are already so into what he's been saying that they can't just discredit him and hope he goes away. They've already tried to scare him away or send him away. They want him dead. And the only way to have him executed is to get the Romans on board. So they first take Jesus and they go to Pilate. Pilate is the political ruler in the area who's been appointed by Rome. He's a Roman guy, and he's right there in Jerusalem because he's also in town for the Passover to keep the peace for all the people that are there. And so they come to Pilate and they say, this guy's trouble, and you need to do something about it. And they say, here are the charges against him. So one is he subverts the Jewish nation. He's going against us. And they say that, I think, just kind of to say, here's why we're mad. But Pilate's not going to care about that. So then they say, this man Jesus said not to pay taxes to Caesar. Now that is a flat out lie, because they already tried to trick him into saying that, and he never would say that. But they're willing to tell the lie, and Pilate has to care about this if someone's saying not to pay taxes. And the third claim they say is he claims to be a king. And Pilate has to care about that. There can be no king but Caesar, and that's who Pilate serves. So he has to have, his attention is piqued. So he looks at Jesus himself and asks the question, are you the king of the Jews? And if Jesus says that, he's have to do something about it. And Jesus does such an enigmatic Jesus answer. He says, you have said so, he says in verse 3 of chapter 23. And Pilate kind of looks at him, looks at the people that are there, the crowd, the chief priests, all those people there, and I think he thinks, this guy is not a problem. He might be a little bit of a smart mouth the way he answered me, but hardly a threat to anyone. I don't see a problem with him. And the leaders, they're all up in arms now. This was their chance. They got to get this right. They say, oh, no, wait. Here's something else you didn't know. He's been stirring up the people wherever he goes. It started in Galilee, and he's moved all the way down here. He's stirring up the people. You better be careful. He's going to cause trouble here. And Pilate goes, wait, did you say Galilee? He's been in Galilee? You know what? That's the territory of Herod, or Herodtory, if that's a phrase I coined on my own. Thanks. So Pilate thinks, good, I'll get this guy off my hands. These people will go, you go talk to Herod about it. He'll take care of you. So sure enough, they pack him up. Herod also happens to be in Jerusalem at the time. This is how all this gets done in one day. And Herod is also a leader, but he's a Jewish leader that serves the Romans to keep track of his own people. And this Herod has actually been curious about Jesus. This is a different Herod than the one that tried to kill the baby boys when Jesus was born at the beginning of Luke. It's a name that got passed down. And he's been curious about Jesus, has wanted to meet him, and he's hoping that Jesus will give him a little show. He wants to see some signs or some miracles. And so he gets Jesus into his close quarters, and he asks him all kinds of questions. Verse 9, he plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. Jesus doesn't even answer the questions that he asks. And Herod thinks, this guy's a joke. I don't know why they're worried about this guy, so he decides to play a joke. He dresses up Jesus like a king, and he makes fun of him. He and his friends dress Jesus up. They make fun of him. They mock him. And then he sends them back to Pilate. This is your problem. I don't see any problem with this guy. And then Luke sends in this little aside. Before this, Herod and Pilate were enemies, and now they became friends. So I don't know how this forges a friendship unless after all this is done, they just sit down and go, what just happened? How did we got played in this somehow. We got messed up in this kind of thing. And I don't know if that's why they became friends, but that's what Luke says. Verse 13 then, so now he's back with Pilate, and Pilate gets the chief priests back together again. And now this is a public situation. Before, I think it was kind of a private meeting. It says, Pilate called together chief priests, the rulers, and the people. And he gets them together and he says, I can't find anything wrong with this guy. And I sent him to Herod, and he said the same thing. So there is certainly nothing that he's done that would cause him to deserve death. So since you hate him so much, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll beat him up, I'll punish him, and then I'll let him go. This is Pilate's solution. There's not a law that he's broken. I can't really execute him for nothing. And so since you're so vehement about this, we'll just whip him, beat him, hurt him, and then we'll set him free. How do you feel about that? And the response of the crowd is nothing like what Pilate would have had expected. The whole crowd, verse 18, shouted, away with this man, meaning kill this guy. And they say, release Barabbas to us. So they say, take Jesus away and give us Barabbas. Let Barabbas go and put Jesus in his place. Barabbas hasn't been imprisoned. He's headed for death. Here's what Barabbas did. He led an uprising, and he's a murderer. And all of a sudden, Pilate realizes they somehow hate this guy, Jesus, more than Barabbas, of all people. So Pilate says to them again, he says something to them again, but his voice must be drowned out because Luke doesn't even say what he says. Verse 20, wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, and now they're shouting, crucify him. Not just execute him. We want the worst form of punishment that we've ever heard of. You Romans made it up. We want that for this guy. And they won't hear anything that Pilate has to say. And for the third time he spoke to them. Verse 22, why? What crime has this man committed? I found no grounds for the death penalty. I can't do this for you. There's no reason to do this. We don't just execute people for no reason. And one more time he says, I'll have him punished, and then I will release him. But with loud shouts, writes Luke, they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. They go wild, insisting that Jesus be killed. And finally, Pilate caves. He's thinking, I'm going to have a riot on my hands. He's watching the political barometer. He's more concerned about his own popularity and making the people happy than he is about the life of an innocent man. And it's not a hill he's willing to die on. He's going to let that guy, Jesus, die on the hill instead. So he releases Barabbas. He releases a known murderer. He releases a known insurrectionist. And he orders that Jesus be crucified. And Luke writes in 23, verse 25, he surrendered Jesus to their will. Look at those parts in the text where Jesus has prayed in the garden, Lord, not my will, but yours be done. And the will of God apparently ends up being the will of the people, at least at this moment, that Jesus would die. He's now been surrendered to their will. So the soldiers lead him away to the place of the crucifixion. This is translated sometimes in English as the place of the skull. I think it kind of looked like a skull poking out of the side of a hill. In Aramaic, it's called Golgotha. In Latin, it's called Calvaria, which is where we get Calvary. So if you hear all these different words for that, it means the same thing. So Luke's narrative of the crucifixion from chapter 23, starting with verse 36, his narrative includes a whole bunch of encounters with different people. People that encounter Jesus now in this very last walk of his life. These are people that witnessed Jesus, witnessed his movement toward the cross and his death. And even along the way, you see Jesus still stopping, still reaching out, still trying to draw people in. I called this study Lepers, Losers, Littles, and the Lord. And throughout the book of Luke, we've watched Jesus grab onto people who are lepers, meaning they literally have leprosy, but also all the social outcasts and misfits. Jesus reaches out to scoop them in. Jesus has looked for the losers, the people that nobody wants to be with, the tax collectors and the fishermen and the people at the low part of the status quo. He brings them in. The littles are the people that are the most vulnerable, literally littles like children, but also women and widows. He's been all about trying to find people and bring them in to be close. And he does that with a number of characters that he encounters. So Luke tells us about the people now who are part of this narrative. We start with a guy named Simon. This guy is from a place called Cyrene, and he's come into Jerusalem from out of town, and it doesn't even say why. We don't know why he came, if he came for the Passover, if he came to sell his wares, if he came, whatever. Somehow this guy gets enlisted along the way, and again, I don't know if it's the right place at the right time, if he volunteers, whatever it is. As the people are following Jesus out to this place where he'll be crucified, he was expected to carry the crossbeam on which he would be crucified. And it's too much for Jesus. After a whole day of no sleep, after the emotions of the trials that he went through, the betrayal of Judas, and then the physical abuse he's endured, it's too much. And so they grab this guy named Simon, and he carries the cross for Jesus. He walks behind Jesus on that path out to Golgotha, carrying the cross. You just wonder what he thinks about it. Why me? What am I doing? Why am I the one? In the narrative, there's always the crowd. Now this crowd is following in procession, and these are the crowd people. You never know. Maybe they do this all the time. Every time there's an execution, they're the crowd that follows along. Some of them are jeering. Some of them are triumphant. Some of them have got exactly what they asked for when they stood there in that crowd before Pilate. But others in that crowd are wandering through, grieving. Hopefully some of the masses that were there to greet Jesus and welcome him into Jerusalem just days before are part of the crowd that are grieving, that are wondering, how did this happen? Within that crowd, there's a group of women. They're unidentified. They're just women who are there, but it says they are mourning and wailing for Jesus. So in the midst of this crowd, in the midst of people who have called for the crucifixion of Jesus, there is this group of women who are not afraid to express their grief. They are wailing in sorrow. They are crying out about the injustice of what's going on in the midst of this crowd. And it's to these people, to these women, that Jesus stops to speak. I think he can barely hold his head up. He's beaten and broken and too tired to carry the cross, but he turns to them. He turns and looks at this group of women, and he speaks directly to them. And he says, "Don't cry for me. Don't waste your tears on me." It's as if he knows this will soon be over. This is terrible, but it'll be over soon. But he says to them, "Weep for yourselves and your children for what is to come." Jesus laments over the nation of Israel and predicts that there's a harder road ahead, a harder road than he is on. And he says there's a time that's going to come where you're going to wish you didn't have children, which would be an amazing thing to say. Children were the ultimate blessing. So the opposite of blessing, you're going to wish you didn't have them. You're going to call out and hope that you could die by nature so that you don't have to see what's coming. Jesus laments and says, the crying that you're doing ought to be for this nation, who rejected me, who forgot, who turned away. And he's already made these predictions about Jerusalem. In not that long, Jerusalem will be taken over and the temple destroyed. But he says to these women, as they mourn, as they grieve along the way, Then there's a group of soldiers that are there. The soldiers stand around. The soldiers keep the peace. The soldiers do their thing. They cast lots, it says, for his clothes. I can't imagine he has clothes that are worth taking, except for souvenirs. And they mock Jesus. They yell to him as he's on the cross, "Save yourself. I mean, you said you were something. Can't you save yourself?" They offer him something to drink. It's cheap, the cheapest wine vinegar that would be used by the poor. The soldiers have put a sign on the cross. For Roman crucifixions, the crimes would be written down and the sign would be posted on the cross, and they've hung a sign there that says, "This is the King of the Jews." So the soldiers are there. And in the midst of all of this, Jesus hanging on the cross, Jesus speaks the first things he says from the cross, and he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." And I think he means all of them. He means the soldiers standing at the foot of the cross. He means those who called out for his death. He means those leaders that have hunted him down and tried to get to this place for so long. I think he means Pilate. He doesn't know what he's doing. He might mean those women. They don't even know why they're weeping. None of them know Father. They're like children. They can't possibly know the complexity of the world in which they're living. They can't comprehend what is beyond what they can see. There is so much more going on, Father, so forgive them. For they are ignorant. They don't know what they're doing. At this place there are also two criminals, says Luke. Jesus' crossmates who are also crucified that day. These two men are criminals. They're punished justly for what they've done. Well, if you could ever think that crucifixion was some kind of just punishment. But Jesus is put between them. You have this image of a bridge between one who will turn to Jesus and one who turns away. One of them, this one I'll say, one of them joins in the mocking and says, "Aren't you the Messiah? If you're somebody, if you're something more than just a guy hanging here, save yourself and save us." That guy refuses to see anything but another criminal hanging on a cross. But the other one, he has seen something in Jesus. He sees Jesus as one who's innocent, and to the guy on the other side, I don't even know how they can speak, but he says, "Don't you fear God? Don't you know where you are?" And to Jesus he says, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And to this man Jesus replies. Again he speaks, and he speaks to this man personally. And he says to him, I'm sure he can't even turn his head. The agony and the pain is so bad, but he says it enough so that he can hear and someone else can hear to be able to write it down. He says, "Today you will be with me in paradise. I won't forget you." All it took was for you to recognize who I am and to ask. Opening the doors to take this loser, if you will, this someone that everyone condemned to die, and Jesus says, "Today you'll be with me." To the last minute of his life, Jesus is making space for anyone. These are some of the people that are encountered Jesus. And then Luke says that nature responds, that for 3 hours it becomes truly dark and the sun doesn't shine. That in the temple the veil rips in half. And you know this because Luke's been telling us all along that Jesus has revealed his power. In Luke, you see he's revealed his power over demons, over disease, over nature, and over death. And now some unnatural things are happening. The supernatural has broken in. And you see Jesus' power over nature as it becomes completely dark. And as that darkness descends, you wonder if the members of the Sanhedrin can remember what he said when he said, "This is your hour when the authority of darkness reigns." And when darkness takes over the whole place, you wonder if they start to think, if they start to realize, if people start to wonder if they haven't made a mistake here. And then Jesus speaks his last words, "Father, into your hands do I commend my spirit," returning back to God, and he dies. And then Luke tells us about another person. This whole last narrative is just about all these different people or groups of people. And here, standing there, is a centurion. He's the lead soldier, the head of the soldiers. And Luke says he sees what happens. He watches what happens in nature. He sees how Jesus dies. He probably has a front row seat to be able to hear and to see everything that Jesus does. And when Jesus dies, his response is to praise God. He breaks out in praise and he says, this was a righteous man. And it doesn't say when it would be that this Roman man began to decide that Jesus was who Jesus said he was. You don't know when he began to believe, but that is his response when he sees what happens with Jesus. And then the crowd's last response is to beat their breasts. That's a symbol of mourning or grief or confusion. And you wonder if they're not second guessing themselves. When all this happens, darkness has fallen and they stroll home in the dark, then they must be wondering. But there's also the people that knew him. The people that knew him, I would say the people that loved him, the disciples and the women were there at a distance and they watched all of this happen. Verse 49, all of those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. They still wanted to be close to Jesus. And then there's finally one new character that gets introduced. This guy named Joseph. Joseph of Arimathea, that's where he came from. He was a member of the Sanhedrin. He was a member of that group of people that ruled that Jesus should die. But Luke tells us he had not consented to their decision and action. He opposed the killing of Jesus. Luke says he was good and upright and he was waiting for the kingdom. He must have heard the things that Jesus said. The kingdom is at hand. The kingdom is coming. The kingdom is near. The kingdom came with me, and the kingdom will keep popping up. The kingdom's going to be realized fully, but the kingdom is already here. He was open-hearted and expectantly watching for the kingdom to appear. And so when Jesus comes on the scene, he knows who it is. He refuses to be part of the death of Jesus. And so he goes to Pilate on his own and asks for Jesus' body. And he takes care of it. He wraps it up and he places it in a new tomb. It's not a tomb where anyone else has been buried. They often did that. This is a new empty place where he places Jesus' body. And then we round out the chapter with those women. That group of women, whoever they are, whoever don't even get to be named, but they are watching. They see Joseph go to Pilate. They see what he does. They see how they get his body, and then they go home and get their things ready to care for Jesus. They're coming back. They are coming back to that tomb. They will observe the Sabbath. All of this is Friday afternoon. So that preparation's on Friday, and Friday night the Sabbath begins, and all day Saturday they can't do anything. But they're waiting to be able to care for Jesus' body. They're coming back on Sunday. And throughout this chapter, those women have stayed near Jesus. They have mourned Jesus. They've been observant of what's happening. They have done the right thing, and they never shied away with how they felt or who they were. These are two really long chapters that contain so much, so many stories that we've heard. And so one more time, I want you to find yourself in the story. So many characters in chapter 23. And I wonder, who might you identify with today as you do your Holy Week practice, as you move toward Maundy, Thursday, as you wonder how you relate to Jesus. I ask you to think about, who do I relate to in the story? And I'd remind you that there's always room in the crowd. You can still say, I'm just one of the people in the crowd. I'm stepping back. I'm observing. I'm trying to figure this out. I'm just trying to see who I think Jesus is. And I'm hearing all their responses. You can always find a place in the crowd. But maybe you would say to yourself, you know what? I'm like Caiaphas or Annas. I'm a high priest. And I find myself kind of inflexible. Have you ever said things like, I'm right. I know this. There is no other way to make sense of this. I know my Bible, I know every verse, I know what it is. That's what the high priest was like. He couldn't see any other way to think or to experience Jesus than the way that he already knew and the rigid path that he had created for himself. And maybe you'd say, oh, I've been inflexible. Maybe you'd say, I might be a Pilate. I'm so afraid of what other people think. I don't want to go against the popular opinion. I don't want to rock the boat or ruffle feathers. I sense that something is wrong here, but I'm just going to let the people do what they want to do. I don't want to mess with anything or get in trouble or have people not like me. Maybe you're like a centurion, where there's been this sudden moment in your life where you recognize who Jesus is. This guy was innocent. This guy is the Messiah. This guy's the guy. And when you hear about Jesus' death, you break into praise because suddenly you've realized, I know who this is. Everything is making sense to me. Praise be to God. I'm a centurion. How about Joseph of Arimathea? Maybe you would say, I've had it with the status quo. I don't want everybody to tell me what I'm supposed to think about Jesus. I don't want everybody to tell me I can't think about Jesus or what to think about Jesus. I want to do the right thing, even if it costs me. Even if it's not the popular thing. Maybe you're a Joseph. Or maybe you'd say, I identify with the women. You don't have to be a woman to identify with them, like you don't have to be a man to identify with Joseph. You would just say, I want to stay as close to Jesus as I possibly can. Even when it's difficult, even when it's sad, even when there's very few people around me who love Jesus like I do, or who think about or believe in Jesus like I do, I don't want to shy away. I want to do the right thing. I'm going to stick close to Jesus, and I'm going to be back on Sunday. It's Friday, and it's dark, but I am coming back on Sunday because I need to be close to Jesus. Wherever you find yourself today, Jesus is the one who's reaching out, who's looking for you, who's looking for liars and littles and lepers and ladies and losers and people who have lost things and people whose identification doesn't start with an L, whatever it is, that there's a Jesus who's saying to you, I open the gates wide for you. It's just one decision. It's just one yes to me. It's just saying I recognize who you are, Jesus. And today, you could be with me in paradise. The Lord be with you.